Hi, hello, and welcome to the Physionic podcast. My name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD candidate in molecular medicine, and today we're going to be discussing a topic that I've covered in the past, but not in with this particular bend or change in perspective. So this is going to be in addition to some stuff that I've covered actually quite in depth in the one book that I wrote, which is on the topic of creatine, understanding creatine. And in that book, I cover really all the different health benefits of creatine. And to be honest, I probably need to update it, even though I finished it less than a year ago. There's already been new research that has come out as the most studied supplement in the world. And talking more specifically, I probably need to flesh out some more on the women chapter. And this particular podcast episode is going to be concentrating on the brain. So I have a chapter on the brain as well in that book. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. But I will be covering some detail in this particular podcast, and it's probably not going to take too long, but I still wanted to touch on it and kind of go over what a brand new review article that kind of pulled all the different references on how creatine affects the brain. I kind of wanted to cover that in this podcast because I thought there's definitely some interesting, useful information. And I'll go ahead and tease this now, that there may actually be a better molecule than creatine supplementation to supplement with that may be more beneficial to the brain. But in a similar regard. So that's where I'll leave that, and I will discuss that at the end of the podcast. So what is this review? So the review itself is called, really simply, Creatine Supplementation and Brain Health, which is in the journal Nutrients, which I've covered many studies out of the journal Nutrients. Okay, so as always, I'm going to be having a few different graphics that I've created to kind of make it an ease of understanding. But if you are listening, hopefully, I've said this so many times. If you're listening, then don't worry, because I'll be explaining things as we go along. Hopefully, all the listening podcast listeners don't roll their eyes every time I say that, because maybe I'm doing just a piss poor job of it, and I just have no idea. But if I am, please give me some constructive feedback that isn't going to completely overwhelm me. If you want, like 3D sound effects and visuals and stuff, I can't quite afford the time to do all that or to learn how to do all that. But if it's small stuff, I'd be happy to try and improve the podcast in whatever way I can. So I'm open to critique. Okay. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into a little bit on the background of creatine, and then we're gonna not focus too much on the muscle aspect because I have covered that many times, but also a lot of other people have covered it, and I'd really like to make this more brain-centric. So we're going to move from the basics of creatine to the just really briefly on the muscle aspect, and then we're going to jump into the brain aspect and some of the unique aspects of how the brain is different from the muscle in relation to creatine. And then I'm going to go into a bit on the supplementation side as well. Probably for more details on supplementation, if you want more in-depth, advanced look, be sure to check out my book, which is really short. It's not super long or anything. You can get through it in definitely like a couple hours. Okay, so creatine is known as a highly ergogenic aid. So obviously in sports performance, a lot of people take it because it allows them to be more explosive, allows them to maintain a particular level of workload for a longer period of time. So you can get, at a particular weight that you're lifting, for example, you can get maybe an additional repetition out of a particular set. So that eventually builds up over time, and that ends up being really, really beneficial. Now, how does that exactly work? Well, there's a number of different mechanisms. Again, all things that I've covered in the book in far more detail, but the primary mechanism that a lot of people focus on is its energetic effect. So what I mean by that is that you have a creatine molecule, and if you're watching, I'll try and point out some of the stuff on my graphics that I've created. You have a creatine molecule, which is the same one that you supplement with, but also your body produces it, and I'll go into a little bit more on that in a little bit. But you have your creatine molecule, and then you have a phosphate molecule that's attached to it that ultimately that changes the creatine molecule structure to a phosphocreatine molecule structure. So creatine plus a phosphate. And that just kind of sits in your cells. Let's just take your muscle cells for the time being, but this also applies to your brain cells. That sits in your muscle cells, and then when you, let's say, do some sort of activity or just anything that requires energy, your body uses energy, the cellular energy of the cell, known as ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and the big importance on that is the triphosphate. 3 phosphate molecules are attached to an adenosine molecule, so ATP. And when those get used through a process known as hydrolysis, so you cut away this ATP and you turn it into an ADP molecule, adenosine diphosphate. So the idea being that you've cut one of the phosphates, and that cutting of the phosphate released some energy. So now your cell is filled with more ADP molecules, and this is where phosphocreatine or creatine has its role, or its primary role, we'll just call it that. And that is by donating its phosphate to ADP and therefore regenerating ATP levels, and therefore the cellular energy state is then preserved or then reestablished. Now, that process happens not, I suppose it could happen spontaneously, meaning that it doesn't require an enzyme, but typically it goes through a particular enzyme called creatine kinase that ends up catalyzing this reaction. So you have the phosphocreatine plus the ATP come together, and they get interacted with by creatine kinase to create the ATP molecule, adenosine triphosphate again. Now, your brain, and this happens in your muscle, it happens in your brain, it happens in a lot of different tissues. Your testes for men is another example, but your brain has a specific isoform, meaning a different, the same enzyme, creatine kinase, but it is specific to the brain. So you will find it in the brain, and it has a particular genetic sequence that identifies it as one that is in the brain, as opposed to the one in the muscle or some other areas. Now, that's the main function of creatine. However, although we know muscle to be the most metabolically active tissue in an absolute sense, because there's just so much of it, right, across our entire body, we have so much muscle. Even if you don't exercise, you have so much more muscle than you do liver or brain or kidney or, other metabolically active tissues. However, your brain is extremely metabolically active, and in a relative sense, it's, I believe, the most metabolically active, meaning that it actually accounts for about 20% of your energy consumption. So it's a really versatile. Obviously, I feel like you probably already know this, just because you're listening to this, and just because you know the amount of thought that you have to go under every single day, that you're constantly going under. So of course that takes a lot of energy. That requires energy. So it requires a lot of this ATP. And the idea then being that if you can somehow increase the levels of this creatine molecule in the brain, then that might bolster that ability to think a lot more productively. Now, I did mention maybe briefly that muscle has its own, or maybe I shouldn't say the muscle. I'll separate them. You have the brain and then you have the body. We're just going to separate it that way. So your body has its own internal system for generating creatine. That system is through 2 different organs. One of them is the kidney, which ends up producing a intermediary molecule and that's going to be important. I'm not going to give you the name right now because it's kind of complex and I don't want to bog this down, but just know that the kidneys take arginine and they take glycine, which are two amino acids. So the same amino acids that would be found in your proteins. And they take those two and then they generate this intermediary molecule, and this intermediate molecule then goes into your liver, and then your liver takes methionine, yet another amino acid, and produces creatine with the intermediary molecule. So intermediary molecule plus methionine create creatine. And there's, of course, enzymes involved in those processes as well. So that gets then pumped out of the liver or released out of the liver, and then it's in your bloodstream. Okay, so that's the body's way of generating creatine. Now, for some people, they're generating enough creatine that they don't need to supplement with creatine, and I've covered that in other content, the reasons why you should stop supplementing creatine under these particular conditions and things like that. So certainly check that content out if you're so inclined. However, for the majority of people, there is a benefit to supplementing with creatine, as in you will see an increase in blood concentrations of creatine, and you'll start seeing greater increases of tissue concentrations of creatine. So, for example, if you were to take a muscle biopsy before creatine supplementation, you would have X amount of creatine molecules in that muscle biopsy. And then if you were to take another muscle biopsy, let's say a week after supplementing with creatine or 2 weeks after, you would see, and you would measure creatine in that muscle biopsy. Again, you would see an increase in the creatine concentration. So typically it's seen as a benefit to supplement, and there's a variety of different reasons as to why, but specific to muscle, like I alluded to before, with performance, it certainly helps quite a bit. I don't think that there's any denying that. However, in brain, which is where a lot of research is starting to steer and kind of at least trying to take a stab at understanding, there does seem to be a benefit as well. And going back to this synthesis idea, is that the brain actually has its own synthesis. So that's why I separated out the brain from the body, because the body has its kidneys and livers that produce its creatine, but the brain has its own creatine synthesis system, so its endogenous synthesis system. And that might be because there is this pretty severe separation between body and brain called the blood-brain barrier that is a semi-permeable, meaning that only certain molecules can get from the body into the brain, and other molecules get blocked and can't get to the brain because the brain is highly protected. So among those cells that end up being involved in this production of creatine for the brain, you have 3 different major cells that are really the main focus of when we're talking about creatine. So you have your blood vessels that feed the entire body. We're talking veins, arteries, capillaries, arterioles, venules, but in this situation, we're just going to say arteries of some sort. And that carries a lot of the creatine. Now, not a lot of that actually moves across this blood-brain barrier. This blood-brain barrier is produced so that it, again, holds off certain molecules and only allows certain molecules. Now, creatine is one of those molecules that can cross the blood-brain barrier. However, it doesn't do so very easily because the transporters are these proteins that have a specific design to them, have a specific structure to them that is recognized, that, for a lack of a better word, recognize the creatine molecule and allow it through. There aren't very many of them on the blood-brain barrier. So what happens is that your brain ends up not relying on the blood system for its creatine, although the body does that, but the brain doesn't. It just produces its own creatine, and it does so through cells known as astrocytes, which are akin to support cells, in a really basic sense, although I'm sure a neuroscientist would probably disagree heartily with what I just said. But for all intents and purposes, for the moment, we'll just call them support cells. And they make up the blood-brain barrier. And so they are in the brain, and they produce creatine, and they release it for other cells of the brain to then take up this creatine. And two of those really important cells are, one, the neuron, which is the cells that allow us to communicate and think, and basically any sort of actually doing of the thinking of any sort, movement, all of that is dictated by these neurons. However, it also feeds oligodendrocytes. And oligodendrocytes are particular cells that, again, I don't want to get too into the weeds with this, but ultimately they allow, for any science nerds out there, they allow for the myelination of neurons, or really the myelination of cells in general. So they create a waxy substance, a fatty substance that allows for neurons to communicate more quickly. And that's where I'll leave it. I don't want to get too in-depth with it, just because then I'm going to go off on a rant about oligodendrocytes and neurons and their interactions and stuff, and it's going to take us too far off topic. But the point is that creatine gets produced, the astrocytes then kick it out, and then the neurons and the oligodendrocytes accept that creatine and therefore bolster the levels of creatine. Now, it doesn't seem, and this makes some sense, that with the foods that we consume, when we consume a large amount of red meat, typically our creatine levels, even without supplementation, increase because we have more of these particular amino acids that are available, so therefore the kidneys and the liver then produce more creatine. However, that does not seem to affect the brain, and that's probably because of this tight regulation here in the blood-brain barrier. So when you compare the creatine levels of vegetarians and vegans to people who eat meat, typically vegetarians and vegans have lower levels of creatine in their musculature and in their body in general. However, that does not seem to be the case in the brain, according to this review. And that is, again, likely because the brain is relying less on the body's stores of creatine and more relying on its own internal source of creatine. So another interesting thing is that what was initially thought is that there were decreases in creatine concentration in the brain for elderly individuals. And it turns out that may actually not be the case. There is a decrease in the body for elderly individuals. However, that may not be true for the brain. And the notable exceptions to that is if a person is suffering from particular mental disease, like neurodegeneration of some sort, let's say like Alzheimer's, some form of dementia, Parkinson's, things like that. Those could affect the creatine levels. So you tend to have lower creatine levels. However, overall, creatine levels do not seem to change in the brain with age. Okay, so that's talking about kind of the overall mechanisms of creatine, how it's formed, the differences between the brain and the body. That kind of sets us up for really just kind of the last bit here, which is what benefits does creatine actually impart, and how is it associated to particular diseases or disease states and whatnot. And it turns out that the lack of creatine in the brain actually leads to reduced learning ability. It also affects major mood shifts. So people, and I actually write about this as well, that people who have major depressive disorder can sometimes see a pretty dramatic benefit from creatine supplementation because their brain has an altered metabolic state, that it's relying more on a particular substrate like fat or glucose or whatever it might be, to a point that it actually has reduced creatine levels. So if you are then able to bolster those creatine levels somehow, which I'll explain to you in just a minute, that can then allow them to alter the state of mind, which is really incredible to think about. So it may have an effect on that, and it may also have an effect at decreasing seizures as well. And the reduced learning ability, I want to quick touch on that. The studies that I read on the topic was that it doesn't really help with kind of menial tasks like, just picking things up or having to wash some dishes or something along those lines. You're not using a whole lot of brain power. It's just kind of, you don't have to think about it a whole lot. But for tasks that take a lot of brain power, like you're doing a complex mathematical equation, or you're thinking about something really deeply, you're a little philosophical, or whatever it might be, that takes a lot of brain power. It seems that creatine does seem to have an effect in reducing the time that it takes to think about different things. And I think there were a few other metrics that I can't remember off the top of my head, but ultimately it led to that conclusion that creatine can be beneficial. However, in this context, they're talking about like if there's a loss of creatine or a dramatic reduction of creatine for some reason, that it can dramatically lead to impairment of learning ability, and has also been linked, I believe, to autism. So there's an association there as well with reduced creatine levels. Now, keep in mind, I am not saying that if you replenish those creatine levels, that autism will just disappear. I'm just saying that there's an association there, and there may be some benefit of it, but that is yet to be found out. And another thing that I looked at was brain injury. So with the few preliminary studies that have been done where they caused brain injury on animals, so as animal models, although I think they have a few retrospective creatine supplementation studies in humans as well. And don't quote me on that, but definitely the animal studies. They found that the creatine allows more brain cells to survive physical trauma. So it most likely has a pretty substantial effect in that regard. So that's why I released a video a long time ago. Well, not that long, maybe a year and a half, something like that, 2 years ago maybe, that where I said, hey, if you're doing any sort of contact sports, if you're not taking creatine, it's not just about the benefit during exercise. It's also like if you get hit in your head really hard and you end up having a concussion or whatever it might be, or you might have some sort of brain damage, creatine could really help you in the recovery and really preserve your brain mass as well. So it's important for that regard. Okay. So those are kind of the benefits for the brain. There are more, but I just didn't want to bog this down again too much. But now let's talk a little bit about supplementation. And this is actually something that I was really excited when I read this, because this is a brand new review. So I've never read it before until just now. And they talk about there's discrepancy between different studies that have looked at creatine supplementation on brain levels. And they've shown that some studies don't seem to show a noticeable increase in creatine concentration or a benefit in the outcomes like learning ability or being able to think about something, whatever it might be, the speed of finishing different tasks, things like that. So some studies didn't find an effect and other studies did find an effect. And when I was going through my book, when I was doing the research for the book, I ended up kind of stratifying and trying to figure out, okay, well, what's kind of the missing ingredient here? Why would some studies show a benefit? Why would some others not show a benefit? And I came to this conclusion, which was only just nobody else had mentioned this at this point, that I was thinking to myself, well, it seems like certain studies used a much higher amount of creatine per day, which is perfectly fine because creatine is a incredibly safe supplement to take. And it seemed like those higher doses seemed to have a benefit, and the lower doses, so muscle-centric doses, that's what I kind of called them, were less beneficial. So they were beneficial to muscle, but they weren't beneficial to the brain. And this review actually mentions that as well. They mentioned that, well, that actually may be the reason. So I was really happy that, I read the studies, I came to my own conclusion, then a year later a review comes out with a few researchers in creatine, and they end up saying, well, that it might be that you may have to supplement with more creatine than you would for the body, for muscle centric. So how much is that? Well, there's no definitive line in the sand of saying, like, now we have decided, we have enough studies to conclusively say this amount. They throw out, for one of the studies, 20 grams a day, and I think the study ran for 4 weeks, and they found a benefit from that. I think I saw as low as 10 grams a day, but I think probably, to definitely be on the safe side, probably closer to 20 grams. So anywhere between that 10 to 20 gram range, which is anywhere between 4 to 12 times more than what you would take for your musculature. Your musculature is definitely going to be saturated. Now, the reason for that might be because the blood-brain barrier only allows a certain level of permeability. So again, because it relies so much on its internal system, there's very little that's actually getting across from the bloodstream. But if the bloodstream concentrations rise to such a degree that eventually creates a pull or a push from the bloodstream past the blood-brain barrier, because it does have some allowance for it because there are creatine transporters there, and that would then increase the levels in the brain. Now, granted, what typically happens in the body is you reduce the level of endogenous production, so the astrocytes and oligodendrocytes and all that stuff would end up using less creatine, or creating less creatine and using less creatine. Or I guess I should say just creating less creatine. Because they're getting more of their creatine from the internal store, or from the blood system. And that's what we find in the body, that the liver will then downregulate its production of creatine if you start supplementing with creatine. But don't worry, because once you stop supplementing, it ramps back up. And again, all stuff that I've covered as well as the mechanisms for why that happens. So ultimately, if the blood levels increase substantially, that may be so much of an overwhelming concentration in the blood system that it pushes creatine into the bloodstream. And that's most likely what's happening, but that is, of course, just speculation. So 20 grams a day. Now, I did mention that there may be something that's better than creatine. A new molecule. No, I'm not selling you anything. Although I guess technically my book, I am selling you that. So if you start supplementing, and I mentioned this earlier, there's an intermediary molecule in the body, right? So the kidney produces with glycine and arginine ends up producing through enzymatic reactions, creates this intermediary molecule, and this intermediary molecule is called guanidinoacetate. And guanidinoacetate is then put into the liver, and it produces creatine with the addition of methionine. Now, if we just focus on guanidinoacetate, however, it seems that supplementing, according to these reviewers, that supplementing with guanidinoacetate is even more effective than creatine supplementation. And they think that, if I can go back to my diagram on the blood-brain barrier, they think that that is because guanidinoacetate not only can traverse the blood-brain barrier by the creatine transporter, but also has its own transporter, a guanidinoacetate transporter, and it can move by passive diffusion, meaning that it can just, by concentration, if there's a high concentration in the bloodstream, it will passively diffuse across the blood-brain barrier into the brain. So a little bit like what I was describing earlier. And that is without the addition of, or without the need for particular transporters to allow that to happen. It can just happen just by mere fact that there's a higher concentration. So that means that there are then three mechanisms that allow guanidinoacetate into the brain, but there's only one mechanism, or at least one primary mechanism, that allows creatine into the brain. So that may be why, if supplementing with guanidinoacetate can be at lower levels and still be more impactful than if you supplement with really high levels of creatine. But from the studies, it seems like you're not going to see massive increases in brain creatine concentrations. But even so, I think that it's really interesting. And it's certainly something that, hopefully I'll have some time to investigate that a little bit further. But if you're interested in reading the review for yourself, it's not overly long. It's not overly complex. So I'll have that linked for you if you're listening or if you're watching. But in conclusion, what does this all mean? Well, it means that creatine supplementation can be beneficial towards the brain, not only towards the musculature and the other systems of the body. But if you supplement with it, you typically want to supplement with presumably, at least based off preliminary data, with much more than you would for your brain, or for your muscles, sorry. So that means that instead of consuming 3 to 5 grams of creatine, you would be consuming anywhere between 10 and 20 grams, maybe even a little bit more than 20 grams. And the review mentions 20 grams specifically. Or, which is something I still need to vet, something that I still need to look into myself, but the review also mentions supplementing with guanidino acetate, which is the intermediary molecule to produce creatine, because that may be more permissive in the brain than creatine itself. And there you have it, folks. Hopefully this was informative, and with that, I hope to have the pleasure of speaking with you in the future. Have a good one. Bye.